to tell you a story of what happened to me on Friday the 13th, just before school started. I was sitting in my comfortable chair reading with my new Kindle, and my cell phone rang, and I answered it, and guess what? It was my son, Nicholas. He was at the doctor's office with his wife, and they were expecting their first baby. And guess what? He said, Mom, quick, get up here. We're having the baby now. In 2 hours, she'll be here. And I couldn't do anything. My toes weren't dry yet. So I sat there and I waited, and finally my toes were dry. So I hopped in my car and I drove, under the speed limit of course, to Plano Presbyterian Hospital. And I zoomed into the hospital when I got there, and guess what? I was too late. Mia, my first grandchild, had already been born. But something else exciting happened to me. I was the first granny to get to hold Mia. She was so tiny. I thought I was going to break her, but I didn't. And then later, Grandpa Terry came up, and she was so tiny, he wouldn't even hold her. And they stayed in the hospital for 3 days. And now they're home. And Mia even got to come to my house one night, and I got to take care of her all night long, getting up in the middle of the night every 3 hours and feeding her a bottle. But guess what, guys? It was fun. Stay tuned for more stories of Mia Leon Weeks.
When I was a little girl, well, my grandmother was born in 1911. And so when I was a little girl, I would sit down with my grandmother. I spent lots of time with her. And she loved to tell me stories about her childhood, because this is 2010. She was born in 1911, and so that's nearly 100 years ago. So her life growing up was way different than what I had experienced. And so I would sit down with her, and she would tell me stories about her life. And one of my favorite stories that she told was about, she grew up on a farm, and all the food, she said that they weren't, they weren't poor by any means, but they didn't have a lot, but they raised the food that they ate. And so they had chickens that laid eggs, they had a vegetable garden, and some of the chickens ended up on their Sunday dinner table, because they would kill the chickens and eat the meat. And so this one of my favorite stories that she told was that my great-grandmother, she would go out every day and she would feed the chickens. And so one day she was out feeding the chickens, and she was feeding them the grain, and my grandmother said that my great-grandmother, anytime she was doing kind of a boring task, that she would always sing little songs, and she made up all these little songs. And so she would sing these little songs while she was feeding the chickens, and she was throwing the grain out to them. And so then she went on about her tasks that day, and she got inside, and she noticed that her wedding ring was gone, and she had this lovely golden wedding band that my great-grandfather had given her, and she was so distraught that she couldn't find the wedding band. So she went out in the chicken yard, and she looked all around, and she kind of back-traced all her steps that day to see if she could find this wedding band. She looked and looked, she couldn't find it. So anyway, several weeks passed, and one Sunday evening, they were going to have chicken for dinner. And so my great-grandfather had gone out, and he had killed one of the chickens. And he brought it in so that my great-grandmother could clean it and cut it into pieces, and they would fry it up and have it for dinner. And in the chicken, when you cut up a chicken, there's a part called a gizzard. And a gizzard is a part of the chicken where when the chicken is eating the grain off the ground, if it happens to pick up a rock or something, it goes into this gizzard and it just holds it there. So when you're cleaning a chicken and cutting up the pieces, you have to make sure and you open up that gizzard and make sure that there's no rocks inside, because you certainly don't want to fry something and then bite into the gizzard and find all these rocks. And so my great-grandmother went about cleaning and cutting the chicken, and she got to the gizzard. And she opened it up, sliced it open, so that she could dump out any stones that might be there. And when she opened it up, she couldn't believe her eyes. She looked down, and there was her wedding ring. So on the day that she had been feeding those chickens, and they had been eating the grain that she had given out, one of them plucked up her ring and swallowed it. And luckily, it went into the gizzard, and it was stored there and waiting for her. And she was so happy, and nobody could believe their eyes that that had happened. But that was one of my favorite stories that my grandmother used to tell me about the days when she grew up and how times were just so different. And it's a story that I've shared with my daughter and my family, and now with you. I hope you enjoyed it.